We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to this week's CART and planning criteria training. I'm Shannon Zizula, State Resource Conservationist with Indiana here. And I just want to start out by giving a huge thank you to my staff and all their diligent work in putting this together. That includes Stephen Ball, who you just heard from, Jennifer Chen, Breanne Lowe, Victor Shelton, Stephanie McLean, Tony Bailey, and Al Tinsley. So you'll be hearing from all of those folks this week, as well as myself. And we're looking forward to getting this training to you. We had originally hoped and planned that it would be virtual or in person, but of course, due to COVID-19, we worked really hard to make it virtual so that at least we could get this information to you and get you on the path. This training this week covers a couple of really key concepts. Number one is we're going to do we're going to tie what you see on the land during conservation planning. So, you know, you all, a lot of you went through last year's CART exercises. You did that diligently, you did that wonderfully, but you didn't have a whole lot of tying that data entry to the land. We're going to try to do that this week for you so that at least this next iteration of CART has that tie back to the land, and you have that knowledge so you can help your farmers, help the resource, and so on. The other important thing is this is required training to either obtain or maintain your planner certification. So instead of you going through an AgLearn, I can't remember, Jennifer, I think she said it's 170 some slides. We're going to give this to you in person, virtual, so that you can ask questions, interact, get more of that real knowledge for that training requirement than you would have by doing that independently. So we're real excited about that as well. Attendance at all of these events this week is mandatory to receive credit. We will be taking attendance, and we will be updating your AgLearn history from the state office if you do participate in all of these sessions. And just so that we're on the same page, these sessions include 2 sessions today, one from 10:30 to noon, one from 1 to 2:30, 3 sessions on either Tuesday or Thursday, and then a final follow-up 2 sessions, much like today's, on Friday. So if you don't have those Outlook invitations all in your calendar, let your resource management specialist know, and we'll make sure we get them to you. And we'll look forward to interacting with you this week on this really critical topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer, and I hope you all have a great training this week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Chen, and I'm a resource conservationist on Shannon's staff. And appreciate y'all tuning in for today and for the remainder of the day's sessions. So I'm going to kind of get started here and kind of kick us off in some general concepts with regards to conservation planning and planning criteria. Before I jump into the actual content of today's session, just a little housekeeping on the virtual aspect of this training. So as you are hopefully aware by now, we are using Teams to provide this virtually, and Teams is available on your computer as well as on your phone if you needed to go that route. Hopefully we won't have any issues with lag or delay of the visuals and the materials that we're going to present. However, if we do, just a suggestion is you can actually use the Teams application without actually even VPNing. So if you're actually teleworking somewhere, you can actually disconnect from that VPN and still access Teams, and that might help improve performance. Just another little item with regards to Teams, and hopefully you see this on your screens already, but there are several functions that are available within the Teams application. You can, of course, view the different participants that are attending, but this little text box here allows you to type in chat questions. So if you wanted to insert a question, you can type it there, and then Stephen, as our moderator, will bring it to all of our attention, and we'll discuss it as a group. The other thing you can do is, if you would prefer, you can chime in and ask your question via audio. So taking
Can
yourself
you
off
hear
of
that
mute.
out there? Clearly, it will not bother me.
We can hear you.
Okay.
But anyway, if you wanted to raise your hand to ask a question, you could certainly do that. And then Stephen will see your hand raised and call on you to be able to ask the question. And these functionalities, in any way, shape, or form, they're relatively easy to use. And I'd ask that you use them anytime you have a question, because the more interactive we can keep this session, the more easy it is to stay engaged for all of us. And so if you have a question, likely someone else has that question as well. So I would encourage you to ask it. And then the last button I'll point out here is just the microphone here is probably by default you're listed as being muted, but you could click this and unmute yourself to ask a question. And then once your question is asked, you could come back up here to the microphone and hit that and then mute yourself again to avoid additional noise. So hopefully that makes sense just in terms of using this tool. And then certainly, as you said, if you have any questions, feel free to type those in the chat as well. All right, I'll go ahead and get started on more of our content for today's morning session. So what I plan to cover in the next hour and a half or so that we have together, I want to talk in kind of general terms about conservation planning, which is something that a number of you all are probably very familiar with and have been doing for a number of years. Others in the audience might not be as familiar with, and it might be somewhat of a newer concept. Hopefully both groups of folks can glean some additional information out of today's presentation. But what I plan to do is talk about this kind of conservation planning process as a general process, but then also tie it to our planning criteria, which is what we use to kind of guide us through the conservation planning process. And for those of you who might have been around for a little while and are familiar with these concepts, historically we refer to planning criteria as quality criteria, and that changed a number of years ago, but it's kind of the same idea and how we use that information. But now we refer to it as planning criteria, and we'll go into a lot more detail this week on what it is, how to use it, and how it relates back to conservation planning. We will be here about an hour and a half, and we'll try to schedule some breaks, even if they're just stand-up breaks, to kind of get up and stretch yourself in order to kind of keep going into the next section. All right, so just kind of stepping back, I don't have a whole lot of material in this presentation with regards to the conservation planning process as a whole, but it's important to understand that the conservation planning is a process, and it's not a linear process, it's circular, but there's 9 steps that are involved or formally recognized in this process. So you might hear folks talk about the 9 steps of planning, and this planning process is what they're referring to. But within these 9 steps, or these different 9 steps, are kind of grouped into 3 different phases, and you can see that here with my graphic on the screen. There's a phase 1 of collecting the information that you need, a phase 2 of deciding what to do with that information, and then a phase 3 of actually applying that or implementing that, and then following up to see how well you did. So this is kind of the general approach to conservation planning. And really, it's kind of a general approach to planning for anything. I think I was looking at this slide earlier when I was getting ready for the presentation, and I was thinking about it with regards to my holiday grocery shopping list. You know, I inventoried all the stuff in my pantry, decided what I needed to buy, and then I went to the store and I got it. So whatever process you're talking about, you kind of walk through the stair step of evaluating what you have, deciding what to do with that information, and then implementing based on that knowledge that you've obtained. But when it comes to conservation planning process is for the purposes of working with a client to help them make decisions on their land, right? So the decisions that we're working on with them are decisions for what activities and practices they can implement on their land to address identified resource concerns. So on this slide, we're talking about conservation planning, and again, the goal is to address resource concerns. So who's involved in this process? There are a number of people that are involved in the details of getting this process going from start to finish and keeping the train moving, so to speak. But two main players that we think about are the conservation planners themselves and the client. The conservation planner is there as a conservation professional to help identify resource concerns, to help offer alternatives for taking care or addressing those concerns, and then of course providing other support to the client as needed. The other core player in this, obviously the client, they are the ones who are typically reaching out to us for assistance. And again, just a kind of a note here that when we do work with clients, it is on a voluntary basis. So they're reaching out to us for voluntary assistance that they may or may not choose to act on, right? That's their decision. The client is also to be engaged in the process along the way. So certainly this is something that you're going to want to keep in mind as you're working through the planning process, to touch base with the client and make sure that what you're looking at or what you're developing makes sense with what their objectives are and what they're hoping to do. That will help both you and the client work through that process and come up with a decision that makes the most sense. And then, of course, the client ultimately will be the one that will be implementing the conservation practices, right? It's their land, it's their conservation. And so having the buy-in along the process is so critical in order to be able to then implement that activity on their land and have that be theirs that they own themselves. So when we talk about conservation planning and we're talking about addressing resource concerns, what do we mean when we say a resource concern? What are we even talking about? And again, a number of you have probably seen similar graphics to this or various graphics that try to capture what resource concerns we evaluate, and we think of things like SWAPA to denote all these various concerns for the soil, the water, air, so on and so forth. So when we think about identifying resource concerns, what we're essentially doing is we're looking at resource conditions and determining whether or not the condition of those resources is good or bad in a very simple sense. And to say that a resource condition is good means that it's functioning at a certain level in order to maintain itself or even improve itself over time. So at minimum, it's maintaining, but even better, there might be activities where the actual condition of the resource improves over time.
Put my earphones in.
Just going to double check and ask folks to mute themselves if you can, so that we get a clean recording. Thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay. So anyway, so talking about these resource conditions, is it good enough as it is, or is there additional treatment that is needed? And when there's additional treatment that's needed, we would say that that resource condition isn't meeting a certain minimum level that we would expect to either be sustainable or to even improve over time. And so when we don't have that minimum level of the condition, that's when we would call something as being a resource concern. Okay, so that's how that information ties together. So, okay, so we're talking about a certain level that we're trying to meet. The next question in my mind would be, how do we know what's good enough? How do we know what that minimum level of acceptance is to say that a resource condition is either being maintained or improving over time? What is that minimum level? And that, my friends, is where planning criteria come into play. So planning criteria are essentially the measuring stick that we use to determine whether or not the condition of the resource is good or not quite good enough. So now I'm kind of bringing in a few terms and trying to tie those all together. So we've heard about the conservation planning process, we've heard about resource concerns, and we've heard about planning criteria. How do all of those things fit together? So if you think about the kind of the general phases of planning, whether it's your grocery list or whether it's conservation planning, in the context of conservation planning, we think about those phases. And again, that phase one is determining, is doing an inventory and determining kind of what we're starting with. What's our starting point? And so with conservation planning, we're looking at those existing resource conditions and making a determination of whether or not they meet planning criteria, if they measure up to that measuring stick. In phase 2, where we're looking at forming alternatives, developing alternatives with the client, or coming up with options for them to treat concerns that we've identified, we're using those planning criteria to help evaluate whether this alternative is more effective than this alternative, or what combination of things we should keep in mind in terms of practices and activities to therefore actually treat those concerns. And then in phase 3, we are actually kind of putting it to the test, so to speak, in that we're implementing the alternative that the client has chosen with them, and we're circling back to see if did we actually achieve the conservation benefit that we expected to achieve with the alternative that was selected. And again, we're using that same measuring stick, aka planning criteria, throughout that process. For those of you who have been with us for at least a couple years, you've probably heard of the term CART, which is the agency's business tool, or one of the agency's business tools. But CART is the Conservation Assessment and Ranking Tool. And this CART application was developed with this process in mind. So CART actually incorporates these planning criteria and these processes into its system to help us along this process. So what is CART? You might have your own name for what CART is. I'll ask you to keep that to yourself for the time being, but I'll go ahead and just provide a bit of an introduction to what CART is, and then we'll kind of go from there to talk a little bit more about how it works in relation to conservation planning. So it is a web-based program, and the intent with this CART is that it is intended to be that decision support tool to help us through the planning process. It's more specifically focusing on kind of those first couple phases of the conservation planning process, where we're pulling all the data together that we need, all the information together that we need from either on-site and or the client, bringing all that information in, and then helping to kind of analyze what those conditions are against our measuring stick, right, our target that we're trying to reach, and then working to develop systems of practices or alternatives that would help to achieve that desired result, or meet the minimum level in the measuring stick. So that's really what CART is designed to do. CART evaluates the land's condition. So it's recognizing where in the world a particular set of fields are in the landscape, and using geospatial information such as soils, climate data, etc., to make some preliminary determinations about what the existing conditions are of the ground. But then it also allows for additional information that can't be gleaned from anywhere else, additional information that can only be gleaned from working with the client, gathering the information from them, and then the information that you as a professional planner have, and your assessment of the site as a professional. So CART brings all this information together and then generates a results data based on those existing conditions, as well as maybe the alternatives that you're proposing, and then evaluates both of those things against that measuring stick, or that minimum that we're shooting for, which is identified through the planning criteria. CART does generate results with all of this in mind. So it shows these results in a couple different ways. This is an example of the graphic representation of that information. And so you can see these bar charts here. And this is just an example of a few resource concerns. So there's a resource concern listing over here on this axis. And then on the opposite side is the threshold. So the threshold is that measuring stick we're trying to achieve. And so as we enter data into the system, we're going to identify what the existing condition of the land is, which is kind of this dark blue bar here. We're going to identify if there are existing practices. So things that the client is already doing on the landscape. They may or may not have been involved with us to do that, but existing practices that that the client has adopted, we can enter that information in here as well. And then we can evaluate from there how far off we are from the threshold that we're trying to meet. And then from that point, we can continue to use this tool to evaluate different alternatives, aka planned practices that we'd like to suggest for the client. And then we can see how much those planned practices impact our resources and improve our resources. And we can see that graphically here. So the CART results are really intended to show us if a resource concern actually exists, right? If we're falling shy of the threshold from the start. But then also how we know if a resource concern is addressed by the series of practices and activities that we're suggesting. So in this case, anybody want to venture an answer? Are there any resource concerns being addressed in this graphic right here? If you're looking at this middle bar, you would be correct. So in this example, the planned activities that are being considered under this alternative would address field sediment, nutrient, and pathogen loss resource concern, right? Because we're reaching all the way to this threshold value. So that's how you could read these types of results. In addition to graphical results, CART also displays the same information in tabular form. So this is maybe a little tougher to read, or it depends on what you prefer, but both options are available. But the idea is the same. You've got resource concerns listed over here. On the left, you have the existing conditions that you've logged into the system based on what you've seen out on site and conversations with the client to come up with kind of an existing level of condition. And then where this existing level is low, you could then look at entering in plan practices, which would show you the amount of benefit those plan practices are crediting. And then both of those together equate to kind of an overall plan total, which then you can compare to the threshold or the measuring stick to see if additional work is or isn't needed. So that's how CART is intended to be used as a decision support tool as well as a planning tool. There's a lot of background processing going on in CART, and the idea behind that is to hopefully reduce the amount of manual input that is needed into the system. But again, there's no substitute for what you as a planner observe on site, and there's no substitute for the input a client can provide. So CART can allows for both. The background information that's associated with CART, again, it's being supplied by the planning criteria. So again, the agency's measuring stick for identifying if a resource concern exists, as well as when we can consider a resource concern to be treated. Those planning criteria are available in a pretty comprehensive document on the Field Office Technical Guide under Section 3. So if you're wanting to brush up on your planning criteria, get more familiar with the ins and outs of just kind of the general aspect of planning criteria and how the agency uses it, this document, this reference is available on the FOTOG under Section 3. If you maybe are interested but don't quite have the time to go through that document from the front page to the back page, there have been a number of documents and references that have been developed here in Indiana that help to kind of hone in on resource concerns that are common in Indiana's landscapes, as well as guidance from Indiana on how to interpret the resource concern information that CART is asking for. So kind of two bullets on this slide. The top one is a general national approach to planning criteria. The second bullet is probably where you're going to want to focus your time, at least initially, on getting familiar with Indiana's approach to using these tools and Indiana guidance with regards to common resource concerns and issues found here in Indiana. And those Indiana-specific references are available through directives and located on the Indiana SharePoint site. I'm going to show some examples of some of the guidance that we've developed here in Indiana to kind of help bring this point home. But one of the things I do want to talk about, and this is getting a little bit more in the weeds on evaluating resource concerns. So when we talk about resource concerns, we're talking about existing conditions not meeting a certain minimum expectation or minimum threshold that we would want to see. Well, how much how much treatment is good enough to be considered good or have met a resource concern? The answer to that question is it depends. It depends on a number of things, and the tools and our planning criteria account for this. So one of the things that it depends upon is what land use we're working with. So if we're evaluating a resource concern, the information that we need to collect, the measuring stick that's used, those things are different depending on what the land use is. We wouldn't evaluate forest land necessarily the same way we might evaluate cropland. Okay, and so the tools account for those differences, and our Indiana guidance does as well. In a number of cases, the path that you would use, the information that you would collect, the questions that you would answer are going to be different for different land uses when it comes to evaluating a given resource concern. In some cases, certain resource concerns are considered not applicable on particular land uses. And so in those situations, we would not assess that relationship at all. And we would just move on to the next resource concern, move on to the next land use and evaluate from there. So one example I wanted to point out to kind of indicate this is ephemeral gully erosion, which is what you're seeing on the screen here. So ephemeral gully erosion, this is a screen capture from that national document. It defines what the resource concern is, shows an objective as to what we're trying to achieve, and then it shows you what land uses this is applicable to. So in this example, it's crop and pasture. And notice specifically that other land uses such as farmstead and forest are not listed here. What that means, the reason why farmstead and forest aren't listed here is because this is considered a not applicable resource concern for those land uses. Okay, so this information is laid out this way in the national document. And we've also accounted for this relationship or these relationships in our state guidance as well. So again, if you look at the national document, that's great. However, the Indiana guidance that we've put together is reiterating these same concepts. So for example, this table that I brought up here is a table that we've developed to provide guidance in Indiana for planning. And it shows you the resource concerns as well as the land uses that we typically plan on. And then you can see the header up here says required for planning. And then the table down here below shows several different values. So in this example, there are certain resource concerns that must be evaluated or must be assessed on given land uses. Ephemeral gully erosion, the answer is yes. If you're doing conservation planning on crop ground, you should be evaluating that crop ground for ephemeral gully erosion to determine if that concern exists. Pasture, ephemeral gully erosion is not required to be evaluated on pasture. Therefore, our table on the screen capture says no. Can it be evaluated? Can you evaluate ephemeral gully erosion on pasture? Yes, if you as a planner identify it or if that is a concern of the clients. It just doesn't have to be evaluated all the time per the Indiana guidance. So that's what the no means. No, it's not required, but it could be if you or the client deem that it should be. The rest of these land uses in this example for ephemeral gully erosion are listed with an NA. And what that means is that it is a not applicable resource concern for those land uses. Do not assess those because there is no good path for documenting the conditions of those land uses with that resource concern. So that's what we mean by not applicable or applicable. And this is how we've tried to capture it in our Indiana guidance. Yes are things that must be evaluated for that land use. No are things that don't have to be, but can be. And then not applicable are things that just don't even relate in the system. So don't assess those. So hopefully that makes sense. And this tabular form is something that you'll see in our Indiana guidance as it relates to general planning, as well as we have some program specific requirements that relate to CSP, and there's similar information put together for that. All right, so with that, kind of reached the first break point here, and I don't want anybody to go away, don't leave, but want to just take a pause for myself to have a sip of coffee and stand up a little bit while I'm here, and then also entertain any questions. If anybody has any questions they would like to ask about these terms in general, conservation planning, resource concerns, and planning criteria. No questions, Stephen?
None in the chat box right now.
All right, thank you. All right, I've stretched, I've sat back down. We'll go ahead and get started. The next section of this presentation is going to go into a little bit more detail on the planning process, the different phases of the planning process, and how.
Wait a minute, Jennifer. I just wanted to interrupt. There is a question for the Indiana specific planning criteria. Where specifically is that located on SP?
Fair question, and it will be, we've had guidance released last year that is available through an Indiana bulletin, and we're going to plan to distribute a similar bulletin for fiscal year 21 information. So it would be available through directives, but then also we have a main page on SharePoint set up for FY21 information, and a link will be provided there. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail later on in the slide deck here about where you can view that Indiana guidance when it comes out, or how to get at it.
Thank you, Jennifer.
No, thank you. Keep them coming, folks. Appreciate it. So again, we're going to kind of walk through each of the phases of the planning process and just kind of talk through going through this exercise with planning criteria and CART in mind. So just as a reminder, a review, that first phase is the data collection and analysis phase. So this is where we're gathering up the information that we already have available to us, getting additional information where we need it in order to kind of paint a complete picture of what the existing conditions are. And then we'll start to take a look at those existing conditions and analyze kind of what that means as far as if a resource concern or multiple resource concerns do exist. All right, so one of the tools that we use in Indiana, and we encourage you all to use as well, is what's called the CART Assessment Questions Report Tool. So that's a mouthful, but hopefully you've seen variations of this spreadsheet as we were working through all of this effort last year in fiscal year 20. We'll continue to use it going forward, at least in fiscal year 21 and beyond, if it's helpful. But long story short, this is a tool that was developed to incorporate Indiana's guidance and approach to planning criteria and CART. And it's, like I said, it's going to be posted on the SharePoint for fiscal year 21. This is an older screen capture, but it will be posted on the SharePoint. And I've had a number of questions about this last year, which is fair. So I wanted to include this specifically. But when you're accessing files like this on SharePoint, what you're doing is you're clicking on them in SharePoint and you're viewing them. By default, you're viewing them within SharePoint. So you're viewing them online. Well, things like this tool, this is an Excel spreadsheet, and it's actually an Excel spreadsheet that's got some bells and whistles built into it with regards to using macros to automate some functions. Because it works that way, when you view it online, you don't have all that macros enabled functionality available to you. So you might have tried to do things, take action in this spreadsheet, and you couldn't get anything to work. The reason for that is because you're reviewing it online. So just wanted to kind of point that out as I talk about this tool. But when you're viewing it online, you should see kind of that first orange circle that I've got there on the graphic. You should see an option for opening it in the desktop app. And if you open it in the desktop app, what it's going to do is it's going to open this same tool within Excel. And then once you do that, you can save it on your computer if you want. You can enable the macros, and then you can use this tool the way it's intended to be used, which is what I'm going to describe here in a minute. So hopefully that helps when you go to access the FY21 version of this once it's available. So the idea behind this report tool is, again, is that it's collecting the information, the guidance that should be used, whether it be national guidance or Indiana guidance. And it's set up so that you can generate the information that you need based on the land uses and the other actions that might be going on an operation, so that you can generate the questions that you'll have to answer through the planning process, and then have the guidance associated with those questions at your fingertips. So you can see the screen capture here. On the left side, we've got land uses listed, because again, as I mentioned, how you evaluate a resource concern is going to differ based on the land use that you're evaluating. So if you can come into this tool, select the land use or land uses that you are expecting to see when you go out to a farm, what's going to happen is the resource concerns that are required to be assessed in Indiana are going to highlight green to the right of that left column. So you can see here in this example, classic gully erosion, ephemeral gully erosion, several others are highlighted in green because these are what are required to be evaluated on cropland in Indiana. So once those highlight, you can come down to the lower left corner of this tool and hit the select required, or the required resource concerns, click the select recommended button. And so when you click that button, so this is the lower left corner here, when I click on this button, the tool is actually going to put a little checkbox next to each of these required concerns. So it's recognizing that, yes, these are the ones that you want to, the resource concerns that you want to evaluate. Can you select additional resource concerns that are not green here? Yes, you can. Okay, so you can check additional checkboxes here if you want. Once you have identified or checked all of the resource concerns that you want to evaluate, over on the right side of this tool is a button called Prepare Form. And once you click that Prepare Form, what this tool is going to do is it's going to create a printout of all the questions the CART system is going to expect you as a planner to answer once you're back in the office. So it's going to generate a report of what those questions are, as well as what guidance to keep in mind to help answer those questions. All right, so for the example here, the screen that just popped in, again, keeping this cropland example in mind, if I had classic gully erosion selected on the main screen, ephemeral gully erosion selected on the main screen, when I go to hit Prepare Form, I'm going to be kicked over to this report of the different questions that are going to be asked of me in CART and that I need to be prepared to answer. So you can see here that there's a column for national guidance if it exists, and then a column for Indiana guidance. So with erosion, it's relatively straightforward. But then as we get into some other questions and guidance, you can see that there's more information included here. But the idea is that all this would be available via printout that you could then take to the field and reference as you're out there collecting information. So one thing I wanted to step back and kind of reiterate, and it may or may not be obvious to you, but is this concept of pre-planning. So when we think about conservation planning, I typically think about, walking the fields, working with the client, maybe over the bed of a truck or in a building or something like that, at least pre-COVID times, but or via the phone or across the counter, things like that. But really, the planning process starts even before that, and I like to think about it as pre-planning, or getting your ducks in a row. And what I mean by that is, even before you step out on the farm, there's some things that you can look at and get together to be more prepared for that farm visit. Now, If you are a veteran planner in your county, in your office, you might not have to do a whole lot of pre-planning. You might be very familiar with the farm you're going to. You might be very familiar with the client you're going to be working with through past experiences. But if you're a relatively new planner, or if you're working in a relatively new area, taking a bit of time ahead of time to do some pre-planning can be really helpful. It can be really helpful to get a better understanding of using your time when you go out on site. And it can also give you some more confidence in what your job is as a professional planner by having some of that knowledge already before you head out there. So what do I mean when I'm talking about pre-planning? What kind of things should we think about? Take a look at what we have on file already, prior communication, whether it's about the land or the client, right? They may not always be the same. Might have been owned by somebody else. So you're working with the same land, but a new client, or vice versa. But reviewing what information we have on file already. Reviewing data, other information that we have available to us. I'm thinking of various GIS products specifically are one great example. We have fantastic aerial imagery, both current and historical imagery that you can to kind of look at things over time. Other resources like soils information, hydrography or flow lines, lots of different things that you can use. And then the planning criteria. So that form that we just showed, that Excel report tool, right? Getting an idea of what types of questions are going to be asked, what type of guidance we have available for those questions and for those concerns. Getting familiar with that so that you know what you need to collect when you're outside. So again, getting prepared by using this pre-planning process. The other thing pre-planning can help do is identify specific areas that you want to visit on the farm. So traditionally or typically when you're going out on a farm visit, you've probably been contacted by the client and they have a specific thing in mind that they want to take a look at. So you'll definitely want to look at whatever that is. If they had called you in for a gully in a crop field and they're asking about a waterway, you'll want to go take a look at that gully, right? Because that's what they called you to come out for. But by doing some of this pre-planning, if there are other high-risk areas or other areas of potential concern on the farm, you can maybe identify those and ahead of time and plan to visit those when you're outside. Farms can be good size, and most folks don't have enough time to begin with, whether it's us or the client. And so doing things like this pre-planning effort can help you really be more efficient with the time that you have outside. So with that, I want to launch. I've got a couple videos in this presentation. I might skip the rest of them, but I think this one is really beneficial. And so I'd like to go ahead and display it for you, if I may. And it's just a quick 5 minutes or so video, and it's really kind of cool because this is a collaborative effort that NRCS did with the University of Wisconsin, and they put together a series of YouTube videos called Learn from an Expert. So I'd like to share that with you.
Jennifer, I'm not getting any sound.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, Jennifer, the way to hey, Jennifer, there's the easy way to remedy that would be to unshare your screen and reshare it and hit the audio toggle when you reshare it.
Can help planners decide which resource concerns to assess in the field. I'm Josh Ordykirk.
I can hear.
Conservation
Thank
planning
you.
experience with NRCS, and I'm happy to share with you the pre-planning steps that I go through as part of the conservation planning process. I'm gathering pre-planning data to help me identify both the resources that might not meet planning criteria, making them potential resource concerns, as well as the field assessment tools that could help me determine the existing conditions. I'm doing this in part because I want to make sure that my field visit is as efficient as possible. Knowing which field assessment tools I may need to use in this planning unit will prepare me to collect the necessary information to complete those assessments. Once I have an idea of what information I need to collect, I can plan a route to ensure that I will visit all of those sites. In this scenario, we have a request for technical assistance from a client. From the initial conversation with the client, I know that the land use is mostly crop. I know that the client's main objective is to keep the farm in good condition for the future generations of his family. With this goal in mind, I've identified all of the cropland and the farmstead as the planning unit. Because I've worked in this region for a long time, I'm already familiar with some of the common resource concerns for cropland in this area. For example, I know that soil, sheet, and rill erosion is a potential resource concern, so I'll want to check on that. I also know that ephemeral gully erosion and nutrients transported to surface water are common resource concerns for this area, so I'll keep those in mind too. Now that I'm familiar with the planning unit and have an idea of what resource concerns I might find, I can start reviewing available natural resource data for this farm. Some of the data I have gathered for this activity are a soils map with map unit descriptions, a 2-foot contour map, and a clean aerial photo. I start by looking at the soils map. I see that there are large areas of steep sloped erosive soils on this farm, here, here, and here. Because of the steep slopes being cropped, I am going to consider soil, sheet, and rill erosion a potential resource concern for this operation. When I look at the 2-foot contour map in these areas, I see a very steep area in the northeast field. Since this is another potential risk factor for sheet and rill erosion, I identify this area on my aerial photo as a spot to look at in the field. On the contour map, I can also see that based off the orientation of the fields, there are row crops running directly up and down the hill in the field in the northwest. In my experience, I know that clients typically need to plant crops on the contour in these soils to meet their tolerable soil loss levels. I mark this on the map as an area to evaluate in the field for the presence of sheet and rill erosion. I mentioned earlier that ephemeral gully erosion is another common resource concern in this area. Looking at the contour map, I can see that there are areas of concentrated flow here through here. Since there is a potential for ephemeral gully erosion to be present here, I mark these areas on the aerial photo. On the aerial photo, I can see that there is a drainage ditch present. It appears that the client is cropping right up to the drainage ditch. This leads me to believe that there is a potential for the presence of several water resource concerns, including sediment, nutrients, and pesticides transported to surface water. Finally, the client had told me that there is a field access road that runs along the north edge of the property that I can drive in to access the fields. I also write the client's name and cell phone number on the map so that I know I'll have his contact information with me when I'm in the field. I will use this to let him know when I'm going to be on site and invite him to be with me during my field visit. Now that I have a good idea of the potential resource concerns I might see on this operation, my next step is to look up the planning criteria for each of those resource concerns. For each one, the National Resource Concern List and Planning Criteria document will show me the planning criteria. It will also show me which assessment methods or tools I may need to run to help me determine existing conditions, which I'll compare to planning criteria later as part of my resource analysis. Knowing which tools I may need to run will prepare me to collect the necessary information when I'm in the field.
So again, that's just a brief 5-minute tutorial on these concepts of pre-planning. Apologize for the audio there, but hopefully that was able to come through for you okay. And again, it just kind of really summarizes these activities we're talking about doing even before you head out into the field. Another kind of practical application of that is kind of displayed here, and that, again, the idea of using the imagery, accessing those other resources. In this case, we're talking about hydrography or flow lines that indicate concentrated flow areas, can help target the areas that we want to make sure we take a look at when we're out in the field. So in this example, we've got this forest land unit, some concentrated flow areas here. So those might be areas that we want to take a look at. And then in this example, this picture here with Victor and Shannon in it is showing an area that's cutting at the edge of the field. This corresponds to this area right here. And so this is a situation where we've got some pasture areas here butting up to a forest area. And in this case, that area is cutting. And you can see that there's some fencing here, but the cut is coming out below that fence. And so using these pre-planning tools, we can confirm what may or may not be happening out in the field, and then we can start discussing different practice alternatives, things to maybe stabilize the outlet, reduce access, things like that. We're going to go ahead and walk through another exercise similar to this. We're going to follow this new employee, Jennifer, through the planning process. So in this exercise, we're going to work with this new employee ahead of a field visit that she has scheduled for a client named Alan. So let's see what she has for pre-planning or what she can do to get ready for her visit. So in this example, Jennifer is gathering information, and she's sharing with us what she knows so far. That he is expanding his operation. He recently purchased 80 acres. It's mostly crop ground, and he's purchased it from his uncle. And this farm is, new farm is located near his main farm in north central Indiana and has been in the family for several years. She also knows, after looking at some aerial photos and reviewing them with Alan, some additional information. He's shared with her that he's removed some of the old stanchions out there. He's moved about 30 heifers over to the site to graze cover crops. He has, his livestock have access to the cropland acres right now with free access to the barn. And before purchasing, Alan had actually rented this ground for about a decade. And he was using the following, has been using the following rotation: 2 years of corn silage and then 4 years of alfalfa hay. So he uses oats as well as a nurse crop and then harvests those for forage. He chisel plows in the fall and cultivates in the spring. Alan has noticed his yields decreasing and has noticed some gullies in his fields. And then the last bit of information that Jennifer has is that he had mentioned several times he wants to keep the farm in good condition for future generations. He's open to the idea of making some changes to the operation as long as they're economical. So this is the prior communication that Jennifer and Alan have had. What kind of information can we glean just from what we've read together in these slides? What is a land use? What land use would we expect to see out there? Cropland, right? He said most of this is cropland. Are there any other things that we should take into account because there's livestock out there? Yes, he said the livestock have access to all the cropland acres. Okay, so that means that livestock have the ability to graze those cropland acres. What are the client's objectives? Objectives, increase yields, right? He says his yields have been decreasing. He also noticed some gullies. So his objective is probably to increase yields as well as keep the farm in the family. And he's open to making changes if they make financial sense. So a lot of information we can glean just from this conversation. So again, what is the land use? Cropland. And so we can use our Indiana guidance and our Indiana tools and take a look at this table and know that we're looking at the cropland column to determine the types of resource concerns that we should be evaluating out there. So which resource concerns should be evaluated? Any of those that are marked yes have to be evaluated for this land use. So we can see any of those here that were listed as a yes, these soil quality resource concerns. And then there's some additional concerns that are not displayed here, but some additional concerns that come along with crop ground would be related to erosion and nutrient sediment loss as well. So this is how we can take the information we know about the farm, identify what we need to be mindful of and looking at when we're working with that client and visiting the farm. And then once we've identified these concerns, we can use that questions report tool to generate the specific questions that we'll be required to answer, and then also have available to us the Indiana guidance that goes along with answering those questions. So again, just a screen capture of what that looks like. In this mock example, we had cropland. Because the livestock have access, open access to those areas, we would select an applicable modifier of grazed. Selecting the land use, selecting grazed, we would see that the following resource concerns would turn green, those that are required to be evaluated on crop ground in Indiana. Once we selected grazed, these additional concerns down here related to pathogens would also be green. So this grazed trigger would indicate that we would also want to evaluate those. Just as I explained in the previous slide, at this point we would select recommended, which would put the little checkbox next to all of these green ones. And then we'd come up to the button you don't necessarily see here, hit prepare form, and generate those questions to take out into the field. So this hopefully helps iterate, how we figure out what we need to assess when we're in the field. Pre-planning, obviously, taking a look at the stuff ahead of time so we can get our ducks in a row, but then also identifying the land uses, looking at that information from the client, reviewing our resources, meaning the planning guidance that we have in the CART questions tool, and then again, viewing the natural resource information that we have available. So again, pulling all this information together so that we can make the best use of our time in the field.
Jennifer?
Stephen?
We have a question. Why does the graze modifier not trigger the feed and forage balance question?
It doesn't trigger anything that's not required to be evaluated. So there's a minimum level of required resource concerns. Feed and forage can certainly be evaluated, but it's not the minimum level required in the state. So, and that minimum level required was really a balance of trying to make sure that we hit on all the key resource concerns and being diligent about what key resource concerns are to balance the planner's time as well as benefiting the resource. The other thing I'll note on this example is that with the land use being crop, we're looking at the grazed cropland a little bit differently than we might say the resource concerns that we would want to take a look at on pasture. Thank you for the question. Keep them coming, folks. I like hearing Stephen's voice more than my own at this point because I've been talking for a while. All right, so we'll keep moving. But again, please continue to ask questions as you have them. So we're still kind of talking through the collection and analysis phase, but now we're looking at taking that resource inventory. So we've gotten our ducks in a row, we've gathered what we can, but now we're going to go and glean additional information that we need to document what's going on out there today. And that is essentially answering the question at the bottom, what are the conditions out there today? So we're going to go back to helping out Jennifer, our new employee, and see what she's planning to do to inventory resources. So we walked through the last series of slides, all those required resource concerns that would need to be evaluated once we've identified that it's grazed cropland. For the sake of time in this exercise, we're going to just look at a few of those resource concerns and walk through the process. So we're going to just focus on classic gully erosion, organic matter depletion, and sediment transport to surface water. So starting with the classic gully erosion, the planning criteria is, or the the threshold, the target that we're trying to reach is that the site is stable and without any signs of active erosion. The tool recommended for evaluating this concern, your eyes and ears. So your eyes as a planner and the observations you make, and then listening to the client's input on the topic. So what observations did Jennifer make? Well, she noted that Alan mentioned he had gullies. When she went out on her visit, he showed her a deep gully on one field and that he hasn't been able to till in that area. And this happened to be one of the areas that she also noted in her aerial imagery when she was doing pre-planning. So those are the observations that were made in the field. What assessments? Field assessments did she use? Her eyes and ears. She relied on her pre-planning research and the field observations as well as the client's input. Pretty straightforward. Did she see any existing practices out there to help address this concern? No. Okay, so this is the process that she went through in her resource inventory to determine whether or not this concern exists. Moving on to organic matter depletion. The planning criteria or the threshold is to maintain, increase, or improve soil organic matter. So essentially not degrade soil organic matter. Tool recommended for evaluating this. We've got a couple options in our tool chest here on this one. CART actually will generate an automated result of the existing condition. So based on the soils data within CART and based on the field location that we've identified, CART will actually give us a preliminary value of what the risks are, what the chances are for organic matter depletion on this ground. The other tool in our toolbox is what we refer to as the kind of the planning criteria or the field-based assessment method. And when it comes to some of these soil health related concerns, there's a tool that Stephanie's going to go into in a whole lot more detail later this week. But one of those is the in-field soil health assessment. And so we can conduct that assessment in the field and use our eyes and ears to make that determination of what the risk is for organic matter depletion. So with this resource concern and with several others in the system, we get an automated assessment result from CART and the data that we put into CART, or we have the option of using the planning criteria or more the field-based method to evaluate. The last resource concern we're focusing on with this exercise is sediment transport to surface water. And this is another resource concern that's kind of got two paths to evaluating and identifying results. The CART method, or the kind of the automated assessment method, again, is using geospatial information based on where the field exists, where it is in the landscape, as well as some planner input. So we would be identifying if livestock are present, as well as what type of residue or cover is existing out there on the land. The other method would be the planning criteria assessment method, or more of a field-based method. And this is a little bit more of using more of our traditional tools, the kind of the pre-CART tools that were available to us. So in this example, sediment is related to several tools, and you can see that on the kind of the bottom portion of my slide. We would be looking at water erosion potential, wind erosion potential, the bank condition. So if this was a field that was next to a water source, water feature, we would be looking at the condition of the bank, as well as if there are any upslope treatments or practices in place. So when we think about sediment transport to water, we're talking about two things, right? First of all, what's the likelihood of the sediment being transported, which we're evaluating with the erosion prediction models. And then also, what are the chances of it reaching a surface water feature? And that is based on how close it is to a surface water feature, as well as if there's any conservation in place to help mitigate that. So again, kind of two approaches that we can take in this resource concern assessment. All right, so just kind of in summary, I'll just reiterate one more time, pre-planning is helpful for you and the client. And after you do the resource inventory, be it your pre-planning efforts as well as what you do out in the field, you may or may not know if the resource concern actually exists, right? You might have an idea based on evidence you see, but you might need to do additional analysis to be able to confirm whether or not a resource concern is present. And that leads us into kind of the next phase of this section, which is analyzing resource data. So essentially what we're talking about in this section is answering the question, which resource concerns actually exist, okay? We've gathered that information. Now we're going to do some additional analyses to confirm whether they exist. And the way CART uses this information is, again, it's going to incorporate planning criteria within the system, and it's going to compare what you enter, what you found, and what you enter into the system against those planning criteria. So you as a user would come into the system, input those existing conditions that you've documented, enter any existing conservation practices you might have observed or the clients informed you about to come up with an initial measure of what the situation is out there. And again, our target here is this threshold value. So if we have any gap, what's going on existing out there and that threshold, we're going to want to close that gap in order to consider the planning criteria met, consider the resource concern treated. All right, circling back with Jennifer, how is she analyzing resource data based on those resource concerns that we're using in this example? So again, here's the 3 concerns that we're focusing on, and we're going to look at the existing condition out there to determine if a resource concern exists. So when it comes to classic gully erosion, again, Jennifer's observations noted that there were some steep sloped soils. Alan confirmed that there are some gullies present, and she did not see any evidence of conservation practices in place that would help with this. So, do the existing conditions, how do they compare to planning criteria? Does it confirm a resource concern, or are planning criteria met? And the planning criteria are site is stable and without signs of active erosion. Based on what Jennifer and Alan have communicated, this would confirm a resource concern, right? He's told her that he's got gullies in the field. So that would confirm a resource concern exists. Moving on to organic matter depletion. Organic matter, again, the threshold, what we're trying to meet is organic matter improved and or increased, right, in the soil. During pre-planning, Jennifer reviewed her communication with Alan and noted that his rotation included 2 years of silage, 4 years alfalfa. He chisel plows in the fall and cultivates the field in the spring. Jennifer went out into the field. She confirmed his management, as well as she conducted an in-field soil health assessment and found that 2 of the indicators in that assessment could be answered yes. Based on that information, how do the existing conditions compare to planning criteria? Can we confirm a resource concern, or is what's going on out there now meeting planning criteria? And just for a reference down here, this is a screen capture of our questions report tool with regards to organic matter depletion. And when it comes to defining the level of organic matter depletion, the national references refer to the soil health assessment, which again, Stephanie's going to go into a lot more detail later on this week. And then also Indiana guidance refers to making that call using tillage operations and what the producer is actually doing on the site. Either way, you can see that based on the analysis results, we're identifying none or extensively depleted soil organic matter. So is extensively depleted soil organic matter maintaining, increasing, or improving? No, it is not. And therefore, organic matter depletion is a confirmed resource concern because what Alan is doing out there and what Jennifer reviewed in her assessment indicates that we are not meeting the planning criteria or that threshold. Lastly, sediment transporter to surface water. Again, I went through the listing of all of the criteria that would need to be met for planning criteria. So all 4 of these items would need to be met. In Also, I'll note here in this example, our T value for soils, or our tolerable soil loss, is 5 ton per acre per year. So let's see what Jennifer found. Jennifer had identified that water erosion is actually higher than the T value. She ran through WEPS. She evaluated bank condition, which doesn't apply. And she also took a look to see if there was any practices in place that would mitigate sediment transport. I could have honestly stopped here at this first bullet, because once she identified that water erosion is exceeding T, that tells us likely that sediment transport to surface water is a concern. And just for reference as well, this is one of those resource concerns that has kind of 2 paths to evaluate. This is the planning criteria method. Similarly, the CART method of evaluating this would show the same, in that we would be identifying the types of crops that are grown, and then based on that same Indiana guidance we showed in the slide previous with the tillage or the soil health assessments, we would be making a preliminary determination on the risk of organic matter depletion, which in this case relates back to sediment transport. So either way you slice it, this would be a confirmed resource concern in this example. So in summary, again, we're just using these analyses, these tools that are identified to confirm whether the concern exists. And then it's up to you and your communication with the client to determine which of these resource concerns are going to be looked at to being addressed through various alternatives. Does Alan have to address all of these resource concerns? Not necessarily, but we would want to provide information to them about alternatives that could address these concerns, either some of them or all of them, based on what his capabilities are. All right, I'll pause there before we move into kind of phase 2. And phase 2, I'll tell you, phase 2 and phase 3 go a bit quicker. But phase 1, there's a lot involved in the collection and the inventory of resources. So we spent some significant time on that one. I'm going to stand up, stretch, keep my headphones on, but ask if there's any questions. None. Okay. Moving into phase 2, this is where we make some decisions, or ask the client to make some decisions. So our job is to come up with alternatives that make sense based on what we saw in phase 1, and then present those to the customer, to the client, and allow them to make the decision that makes the most sense for them. There is a little video on this one. I'm going to go ahead and skip it. It's not quite as helpful as the first one, but it kind of summarizes the idea behind phase 2 and helping to decide which alternatives to come up with and then present to the client. So this is all about figuring out what to suggest. What are the paths for success in addressing the resource concerns we identified? In short, how do we decide what practices to put into the alternatives? A number of different ways to do this. If you are an experienced planner and you've been in the area you're working in for a while, you probably have a really good idea of what some practices are that can help address some resource concerns. But if you don't, if you don't have that knowledge, that institutional knowledge, there are some tools that can help come up with those decisions. Another thing that you can always use, kind of the second bullet here, when you're out on the site, look at what the producer's already doing. Like if there are any conservation practices out there, that gives you a clue that they're already familiar with what those practices are, how to manage them, how to maintain them. And so there might be concerns on different parts of the farm that could be addressed using similar or the same types of practices, which again, the producer is familiar with. The third bullet here is a note to keep in mind, generally speaking, but also kind of in the context of working within the CART system. You can identify a practice as being either a primary practice or a supporting practice or secondary practice. And what I mean by that is there are certain practices that you would schedule or present to directly benefit the resource concern, but then there's other practices that might go along with that to make sure that the primary practice functions the way that it should. So for example, a grass waterway might be a primary practice. The rock outlet might be a supporting practice. The tile might be a supporting practice, because those things are ensuring that that primary practice is functioning. So it's just some terminology that you might see as you go through the CART process, primary and supporting. All right, so kind of circling back to, we've entered this information into our systems, and aka CART. So now we're using that CART information to help make some decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, when I showed this graphic, we inputted existing conditions in CART, this dark blue, any existing practice on the farm already, this area in teal. And then now we're starting to formulate alternatives, different combinations of practices that we can recommend to help address those resource concerns. And those planned practices show up graphically here with this light blue bar. And so you can see that whatever alternative this was, I don't remember offhand, but whatever alternative this was, it is addressing field sediment, nutrient, and pathogen loss, because we're meeting the threshold, but it's not addressing soil quality limitations, and it's not addressing concentrated erosion. The reason I say that is because we still have a gap between what we've planned and that minimum target that we're trying to reach. Again, looking at the same information in tabular form, we see that here, threshold is the mark we're trying to meet. This alternative of practices that we've input into the system falls short on classic gully erosion as well as organic matter depletion, but meets here in the middle with regards to sediment erosion, because it's matching that threshold value. And if we match it or exceed it, the resource concern is considered treated. If we don't, that resource concern is still present even with this alternative. Another nice thing about CART is when you see these little caution signs pop up, as you can see here, and right below my pop-up there, those little caution signs can help provide additional information. So more often than not, when we're working on a farm, we have multiple fields. When we're working through the CART assessment and developing alternatives of practices to suggest, we're doing so on multiple fields. And because the CART system uses geospatial information, location-specific information, the alternative that we propose might help some fields, but not all. And so what I mean by that is, if we have 10 fields in this example exercise, those 10 fields have different soil types. Those 10 fields may have different slopes. Those 10 fields might have other differences that are inherent to the ground that are going to make the amount of treatment that's needed different. Steeper soils might need additional treatment to meet the threshold. Flatter soils might not need as much treatment to reach the threshold for erosion. And that, again, is based on the fact that there are differences in the land, and CART incorporates some of that. So when we get to this section where we're evaluating either existing conditions or our planned alternatives, what we're proposing, if we're not meeting the threshold, we can click in this caution sign here and see specifically which land units are not meeting. So it provides us additional information. And so there might be additional conservation that's needed to offset the erosion on those steeper fields. And so we might need to include that in our alternative. Do we need to do that on every field? Not necessarily. But using this information and the kind of the caution sign information here can help us kind of hone in on which fields might need additional treatment in order to meet the planning criteria. Ooh, this slide gets a little busy. I apologize for that. But this is just trying to build on some of the things that we've seen already throughout the presentation. We're building this information into CART. Not only did we have the existing conditions we talked about previously, but now we're entering in those planned practices to try to get us to meet or exceed that threshold value here. When we're talking about formulating alternatives and evaluating those alternatives, we want to consider a number of things. We want to consider what we call a no action alternative. So what would be the state of the resource if we didn't do anything? If Alan continued to farm the way he's been farming, what would be the result of that? What resource concerns would be met, if any? But then as we're developing additional alternatives where we're suggesting groups of practices, we want to consider the positive and the negative impacts of those practices. We also want to consider special environmental concerns, if there are additional items out there that might dictate which alternative we propose, things like cultural resources, threatened and endangered species. We also want to consider the human factors. So when we're talking about bundles of conservation practices and activities, we got to be realistic about, how much they're going to cost, how much the client is willing to invest, what kind of labor force do they have? Are they a labor force of one? If so, they might not be up to taking on a whole lot of management or changes in management. What the ownership is. If they rent the ground, they might be less likely to make long-term investments than if they own the ground. So those are just some of the other things you need to keep in mind. So kind of focusing in on the practice aspects of them, of these alternatives. How do you know the positive and negative impacts of practices? Well, we actually have some tools to help assist with that. Again, if you're a seasoned planner and you're familiar with your work area, likely you've seen it or heard about it, the positive and the negative impacts of practices that might have been recommended over the years and implemented on farms. So you might have a real strong knowledge of this already. But if you are less familiar with the area, or if you're looking at practices you might be less familiar with, there are some tools that can help quantify how much a particular practice can benefit different concerns. So I'd just like to show you that as a reference in case you want to refer to it. So going back to Jennifer, she's now working on developing alternatives to communicate back with Alan. And Jennifer has developed, in addition to her no action alternative, she's developed two alternatives, one with management practices and another with structural practices. And just kind of set these up here for this mock example. In reality, oftentimes when you develop alternatives, you're probably developing a mixture of management and structural practices in your alternatives. But in this example, Jennifer used a reference called the CART Practice Points Spreadsheet, which is another mouthful, but the CART Practices Points Spreadsheet to help identify which practices can benefit cropland for the resource concerns we're focusing on. So again, the resource concerns are listed here. And that practice point spreadsheet, it's a beast of a spreadsheet, but it can be managed, but it lists out how much benefit each practice provides for a given resource concern on a land use within CART. So as we were looking at those graphs with the bars moving to the right, as we were looking at the table where the threshold value was 50 and we're sitting at a 31, we can use this CART practice point spreadsheet to help identify which practices are going to help us meet the mark. And that mark in this case would be the threshold value that we're trying to meet. So this is just a screen capture to kind of show you what that spreadsheet looks like. So in Jennifer's mock-ups, she developed, like I said, for her management alternative, management-based practices. She's recommending cover crops, critical area planting, and reduced tillage. So she came to the conclusion of these practices by looking at the benefit point spreadsheet. So you can see here, the top of this spreadsheet lists the practice code and name, the narrative, the resource concern component. So you can see here organic matter depletion, sediment from erosion, and then the land uses over here to the right. So what she's done is she's evaluated this spreadsheet, and a couple ways you can use this is you can filter to a particular practice if you have that in mind, or if you're looking for different practices and not sure which one to look at first, we can go ahead and focus on the fact that we're developing alternatives for cropland. You could click on the filter icon here, filter out the zero values, which would be the things that don't provide any benefit, right? and then limit your list down to looking at those practices that provide some amount of benefit on cropland. And then from there, you can filter further by resource concern component to really hone in on the resource concerns that you've identified on the farm. Do you have to use the spreadsheet? No. It's just a reference, a resource that's out there and available if you're not sure what you should consider. So in this example, this is just displaying the fact that these are the resource concerns Jennifer was focusing on. You can see cover crops are going to provide benefit for both organic matter and reducing sediment. The critical area planting is where she came to help address the gully erosion by establishing some perennial vegetation out there. And then, of course, the change in the tillage operations to a reduced till situation would benefit the erosion as well as the movement of that eroded soil, aka the sediment transport. So again, this is just a graphic to kind of show you, if you aren't certain what types of practices to consider, that this tool is available and how you could use this tool to help kind of quantify how much benefit you would expect to see in CART by scheduling these planned practices. Similarly, the structural alternative does the same, although it's looking at different types of practices, but again, the same idea applies. And you can see here that in the structural example, we're looking at a waterway, terrace, and a wascob, and the benefit points that come along with those. And again, focusing in on the resource concerns that Jennifer identified out on the site.
Jennifer, we have a question if you'd like to address it.
I would.
Okay. Will these scores factor into how many points are given, meaning it will factor into the apps funded, the applications funded?
I'm going to assume that's the question. So the answer is yes, a bit. So what we're talking about in this presentation is really the planning side of things. So this is the CA, or the conservation assessment side of CART. The other half of CART is the ranking tool. And in short, the way that's all related is this assessment information is transferred over to the ranking tool, and a percentage of the ranking score is based on the conservation assessment. So yes, these points will impact that ranking score a bit, but I guess I just want to be cautious and say that this isn't the only thing that impacts the ranking score. We actually have ranking questions that you as the user will answer in CART that provide ranking points for a given Farm Bill application. But a slice of that pie, that ranking score pie, is based on the conservation assessment, aka this business I'm presenting on this morning. So certainly if you're addressing resource concerns, that all other things being equal, that would shake out slightly higher than another application, but there's a lot of other pieces of that pie that impact that ranking score.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question. Is CART to be used for all planning? What about CTA planning, such as CWI or watershed programs? And what about CRP, please? Good luck with that one.
Who asked that question? No, I'm kidding. You don't have to tell me. But no, it's a fair question, and I'm teasing because it's a good one. CART is not required to be used for all planning at this time. However, it's encouraged. It is required to be, it is a required piece of processing data to make it available for a Farm Bill application. So you have to use CART in order to create a viable application to be considered in EQIP and CSP. Do you have to use it for a CRP plan? Not at this time, but I will say that that's something that the agency is looking at.
Can I chime in there a little, Jennifer?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you said it perfectly, Jennifer. How national headquarters actually is requiring CART to be used for CRP. I'll say that out loud. In Indiana, we are not requiring it yet. So at this point, it is not required for CRP in Indiana, but that's actually somewhat counter to what national headquarters has issued. So we're cool with that. Again, I'll just add to what Jennifer said too. CART is not required for general CTA planning. However, planning does rely on planning criteria. So if you don't use CART, which does, hopefully you've seen there are some efficiencies, if you will, compared to planning criteria for some resource concerns, then you would revert back to planning criteria if you do not use CART.
Thank you, Shannon. All right. So again, just kind of summarizing the two alternatives here, in addition to the practices and the benefits to the resource concerns that the practices provide, some of the kind of the human factor items here that are listed in italics. With the management alternative, there's obviously a change in management to reduce till. Hopefully that equates also to fewer tillage passes, which is a fuel and time savings, increased profitability with increased yields. However, that will be taking some land out of production for that area that we're going to establish with the critical area planting. Likewise, on the structural alternative, in addition to the practices themselves and their benefits to the resource concerns, we're also taking land out of production, right? If we put it in a grassed waterway, this might be a costlier alternative from the get-go because we're doing more structural-based practices. And then there also would be maybe some increased maintenance on maintaining those practices. So again, this is just kind of a snapshot of the things to consider when you're proposing these alternatives to the client. The other thing I want to point out, and I apologize, I'm going to go just a couple minutes over, but I'm going to wrap up here pretty quickly. But when you're talking about alternatives or when you're having conversations with a client about, making recommendations on what they might consider, you're selling. You're being a salesperson, right? You're selling, pitching the idea why these practices are a good idea, how they might be beneficial, while also relaying the realities of, increased maintenance or, some of those other things that they need to keep in mind. But because you're being a salesperson, right, you want to try to key in on what motivates your client as best you can. And how do you do that? Well, keeping in mind their objectives, right? What they care about is those objectives that they relayed. And in Alan's case, it's being profitable, which more often than not, most all the clients we work with are going to be concerned about that, and fair point. But then also, maintaining the farms. So again, you can cue in from this that he's willing to maybe make some long-term changes if it makes sense from a financial sense. When you're selling, speak in plain language. Please don't say CART when you're talking to clients. They don't know what CART is. They don't care. But keep that in mind, right? Relay information in plain language, even if it's different than what we use in our agency speak, right? And then again, being upfront about the pros and the cons. And then lastly, again, this is more when we're back to operating, quote unquote, as normal when we're going out on the farm. Speak to your client, look them in the eye, listen, practice active listening. I talk to my boys at home about whole body listening. Listen with your eyes, listen with your ears, listen with your body. They're providing you a lot of good information that will be helpful to you, so listen to it. All right, so with that, it kind of wraps up that second phase, again, where we're coming up with ideas on how to address those concerns with different alternatives. We talked about using the planning criteria and the other tool, the practice benefit points spreadsheet, to help with that. And then, of course, as we're working through this process, we want to document the decisions that the client has made. And that documentation might be documenting on assistance notes, scheduling practices, and creating a full conservation plan. Lastly, and I'm going to go through this real quick, that last phase is the plan, implementing it, and then as you're able to evaluate and see if it actually worked. So we're talking about designing the plan, designing the practices, that the client has decided to do, keeping in touch with them to make sure they know what they need and they feel comfortable moving forward. And then for us, we want to make sure we document that practice is implemented. We report it as applied or certified in Conservation Desktop, or if it's tied to a Farm Bill application, that we certify that practice as complete in ProTrax. We might need to collect additional information out to do practice design. So once we've selected the practice and planned it, we might need additional information. What practices do we have to design? What kinds of practices? Engineering practices? Yep. What about management practices? Yep, sometimes we might need to collect additional data to make sure we design that management practice appropriately. Want to make sure to confirm we've got no hurdles with regards to special environmental concerns that need to rethink our alternatives or the practices that we're proceeding ahead with. Hopefully this is identified way earlier in the process, but if you haven't identified it by now, you certainly want to make sure and confirm that there are no hurdles that way. Finalize the extent where the practices are going, and then, like I said, document those once those are completed. All right, so stepping back, my last couple slides here before we pause and break for lunch. Just reiterating some key points here. The relationship between planning criteria and resource concerns and how they work through the planning process, and that communication with the client. So critical. You hate to go off on a path that doesn't make sense when you come back to present it to the client. And then I'll just wrap up, kind of pointing out some of the references I used in this presentation. That national resource concerns list and planning criteria that's available on FOTOG, Field Office Technical Guide. And then the bulk of the references are more Indiana specific, and those are posted or will be posted on the Indiana SharePoint site. With that, I am finished with my presentation. Just kind of wanted to lay out a little bit of what to expect for the rest of this week. What I did this morning is a real overview, kind of boiled down a lot of concepts, but also tried to bring in Indiana's approach to these topics. So we'll provide a lot more detail on kind of the nuances of all of this throughout the remaining sessions scheduled this week. With that, Stephen, I'll turn it to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to be stopping the recording. If anybody has any questions that occur to them during lunch or just would like to ask it after they had something to eat, if you're entered into the chat session, we'll address those at the beginning of the next session later on today.
Thank you. Appreciate your time and attention, folks.
Nothing in the chat, so I guess we're over.
All
Good
right.
job, everybody.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was good.
Stephen, you want to stop the recording? We can have a little conversation.